We have with us today Dr. Thomas Ice, who is the director of the Pre-Trib Research Center. And that center is conducting a seminar, a program, a conference this week on Christian Zionism and on the future of Israel. And we're delighted to have you with us, Dr. Ice. And would you tell us a little bit about yourself and your ministry?
Well, I'm director, as you say, of the Pre-Trib Research Center, and our organization was founded by Tim LaHaye and myself about 11 years ago to study, teach, and defend the pre-tribulational rapture doctrine and related prophecy doctrines. So we deal with pre-tribulationalism, and we also deal with related issues like Israel, for example, because if you don't believe in a literal view of Israel, then the pre-trib rapture doctrine doesn't make sense.
Why pre-trib? I mean, that sounds a little restrictive to what a lot of Christians believe.
Well, if you're a pre-trib, then that means you believe interpreting Bible literally, including prophecy. That means you're premillennial. It means that you believe in a futurist view of the rapture, the tribulation, the second coming in the millennium. And so that means that you believe that Israel has a literal future as opposed to the church superseding or taking over those things. And so a person who's a pre-tribulationalist believes that when the Bible talks about Israel, it means Israel. And so therefore you have all of these hundreds of Old Testament promises that haven't yet been fulfilled. And at the same time, you don't believe that the New Testament somehow replaces Israel, or you read the New Testament after interpreting it wrongly about Israel, then you read it back to say that it doesn't refer to what it's saying. And so it's part of the overall theological system of our beliefs. And so that's why we're dealing with that important issue.
What do some other Christians believe that are not pre-tribulationists?
Well, a lot of people believe that the church somehow superseded or took over Israel or replaced Israel. And so when you read, these dozens of promises in the Old Testament that talk about Israel having a future, for example, one day Jerusalem is going to become, the major city in the world. One day Messiah is going to come and sit, on a throne in Jerusalem. Or one day Zion is going to become the center of the world. Or one day the Jewish nation is going to rule over the other nations. These kinds of literal promises that everyone admits hasn't been fulfilled. And if you are pre-tribber or a literal interpreter of all the Bible, including Bible prophecy, then you believe that those have to be fulfilled. And since they haven't been fulfilled in the past, everyone agrees, then they have to be fulfilled in the future. And in conjunction with that, we believe that since these are future fulfillments, that the modern state of Israel, that God is setting them up to fulfill some of these issues. And so therefore we think the modern state of Israel is not yet a full fulfillment of prophecy, but it's a partial fulfillment, meaning it's in the process of getting ready for God's plan after the rapture, when they're going to use the nation of Israel to, it's going to be the center of the world, and it's going to be a burdensome stone to all the nations, and the whole of history is literally going to revolve around Jerusalem and Israel, and so we believe those are literally going to happen.
Israel has to be returning in unbelief in order to accept the Antichrist, in order to be saved at the end.
Well, that's right. There's even some premillennialists, Tom, who say that, well, the Bible doesn't talk about a bunch of unbelieving Jews over there. Well, it does, because in order for them to become believers, they have to return in unbelief to go through the process. There's a dozen passages in the Old Testament that talk about this purging process, that the tribulation is going to be to purge out the unbelievers so that all are left, toward the end of the tribulation are the elect Jews who will be saved. And they will then call on Christ to come and rescue them. And so, sure, there are unbelievers over there. As I like to tell people at conferences, in order for a person to become a believer, you have to be an unbeliever, right? And
I was once one of them myself.
That's right. Everybody who's a believer used to be an unbeliever. And so that's why he's gathering the nation in unbelief, because there's going to be a process that the nation is going on. And so he's still in that in-gathering stage of the nation to the land for the events of the tribulation to take place. And so therefore, people say, well, they're unbelieving Jews over there. Yeah, they are. And they're being prepared as a national entity to make a covenant with the Antichrist, to rebuild the temple by the middle of the tribulation. so that certain events can take place, and it's going to, the end process of this 70th week of Daniel, of the 7-year period, will be the conversion of all Israel at the end of this process, and then they will be in belief, and God will then bless them for the 1,000 years of the millennium.
There are also some believing Jews there now.
Well, there are.
And they're the remnant, right?
That's correct. They're the remnant in the current church age. That's exactly right. And so we also believe in evangelizing Jews in the present, because I know you've been involved in that, and many people who believe like us have been the bulwark of people who believe in evangelizing not just Jews, but all people, but especially Jews.
Well, now tell us about the conference and what the subject of the conference is this week.
Well, it's on Israel, and I started the conference with a paper on the history of Christian Zionism. And the reason I did that and chose that subject is, well, I'm writing a book on the defense of Christian Zionism. And a lot of people don't realize that the history of Christian Zionism goes back to the post-Reformation era. In other words, the late 1500s, early 1600s. For example, in Britain, in 1290, in medieval Catholic Britain, they expelled the Jews out of their country. And once the Reformation came in and people started having learning Hebrew again in the universities, and they started translating the Bible in the language of common people, and for the first time in all of church history, Tom, the average person doesn't realize this, that people started knowing and learning the Old Testament stories for the first time in the history of the church, just 450 years ago. You know, and when you think about that, that's amazing.
It is.
And, you know, before that, Christianity was some form of medieval Catholicism with, 12 stations of the cross, the Mass.
Search for the Grail.
Yeah, those kinds of, wives' tales that dominated Christianity. And once they started learning the Bible, especially in Britain, for example, they started identifying, the English people identified with the people of Israel. They started naming their kids, the Puritans especially, with Old Testament names. They started learning Hebrew. They started saying when events would happen in British history, hey, that's kind of like what happened over in Judges, or that's like what happened over in Samuel, you see. Not that they thought they were fulfilling it, but they were seeing parallels, and they began to learn the details. And as they begin exposed to the details of the Bible, they realize all these promises. And so they begin becoming premillennialists by the late 1500s, early 1600s. And they begin saying, hey, Israel's going to have to return to the land. Israel's got a future. And that was called restorationism back then. We call it Christian Zionism today. Because Zionists are people who believe that the Jews have a right to the land, and Christians who believe that the Jews have a right to the land are called Christian Zionists. But back then they called themselves restorationists. And so, for example, there was a guy named Francis Kett, who was an academic guy in the late 1500s in England, and he taught just a couple of pages in a book that he wrote that the Jews were going to return to the land and occupy the land of Israel, and God was going to fulfill their promises. Within a month, he wrote this book, and in January of 1589, they burned him at the stake for holding those views. Now, this is England that he kicked the Jews out, and see, that was viewed as being somehow, yeah. But within the next 30, 40, 50 years, as the dissemination of the understanding of the Bible grew, then by the mid-1600s, under Cromwell, for example, and the Puritans, almost everybody came to believe that. And so by 1655, Cromwell goes back and passes a law overturning the expulsion of the Jews, and they passed a law begging Jews to come into the land of Israel. And so they went over and imported a bunch of Jews back to Israel from Holland, and Britain, that began to prepare the way for Britain's role in the 20th century of the Balfour Declaration, and then her eventual role of helping Israel become a nation.
Britain had a major role in the restoration of Israel, didn't she?
She really did, and this became a standard belief among Puritans, for example, and in the United States here, it's just amazing. We didn't have that history, that baggage of medieval anti-Semitic Catholicism that Europe had. And so the Puritans basically started this country and colonized it. And you had people like the Mather family, who the famous Mather dynasty, they call them. There was Richard Mather, who's the father, who's a Cambridge graduate who immigrated over here, and his son was Increase Mather, who became the father of Cotton Mather. And these are some of the intellectual Christian giants of America in the 1600s. And Increased Mather, he only wrote about 125 books in his life. Now, his son Cotton wrote about 425, you know, and most of them were multi-volumed. But, you know, they didn't have television like we do today and other distractions. And they knew how to concentrate. And Increased Mather's first book that he ever wrote was a book advocating the restoration of the Jews to Israel. And it was his favorite subject, and he revised the book 6 times. And this set kind of a tone for America. So you even have presidents like John Quincy Adams, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington even, included in their foreign policy statements that they wanted to see the Jews return to the land of Palestine or Israel and, you know, return there. And so America has been different than Europe because we got started structurally, foundationally on a pro-Filio-Semitic background.
Were some of the major universities involved in this?
Well, Harvard, for example, that Increased Mather was the first president of, I heard until the late 1800s, they made the valedictorian of Harvard give his annual address in Hebrew, not in Greek or Latin, but in Hebrew until the late 1800s. It shows you the Jewish influence that came into Puritan, and really that's where what we call Judeo-Christianity developed with the Puritans in the 1600s, who simply started reading the Old Testament and said, hey, it gives us a promise. And what's encouraging about that, Tom, is today we're fighting a battle. Increasingly more people are criticizing us as evangelicals for supporting Israel. I mean, they're blaming everything from the Mideast War to the high price of oil. You know, if you Gentile Christians wouldn't support Israel, then America would be like Europe, and we would be anti-Israel. But because we're anti-Israel, because we're pro-Israel instead, then we kind of are a swing influence in the United States. And it's inspiring to me as people are starting to criticize us. You know, we're not being burned at the stake yet or anything like that for our pro-Israel stand, but it's encouraging to go back and see the tradition that we walk in. That's 450 years old among people who simply believe the whole Bible, that it has a complete plan for Israel and the church. And it's motivating to me, so that's why I gave a paper on this, and this is why I'm going to include this chapter in our book on Christian Zionism.
Well, you certainly have had a remarkable ministry with the Pre-Trib Research Center, and it's had great growth through the years. I've been attending these conferences for about 11 years.
Yeah, you're one of our original guys.
Just about. And we praise the Lord for you and your ministry. And you're associated with Dr. Tim LaHaye,
right,
who's one of the leaders of your organization. And we appreciate all that he has done in bringing people's attention to the second coming of Christ and the rapture and the importance of Israel in the world today.
Well, I just want to go on record as a lover of Zion.
Amen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.